19 October 1989. Vandellòs for nuclear power plant, Camp, Catalonia, Spain. Inside the control room, operators watch pressure and temperature traces for carbon dioxide coolant circulating through a graphite-moderated core. Later reports will record that during the fire sequence, gas pressure peaked at 29.7 bar, design leak threshold at 30.1 bar. Coolant inlet temperature reached 310 degrees Celsius, limit for preventing radioactive gas release at 315 degrees. The natural uranium, graphite gas reactor philosophy assumed that a major hazard would start in the nuclear island. That night, the limiting parameters came not from a reactor transient, but from a conventional turbine generator fire and resulting flooding in auxiliary cooling systems. El Critic, summarizing Consejo de Seguridad Nuclear data, notes 29.7 bars of gas pressure. Above 30.1 bars, radioactivity leaks to the exterior would have begun. The incident will be officially recorded as having no radiological consequences for population or environment. Yet CSN's own figures show the reactor within a fraction of its design pressure and temperature margins. 1972. Vandellòs re l'Hospitalet de l'Enfant, Tarragona Province, Catalonia. A CSN Información General entry describes Vandellòs I, a 480 megawatt electric gas-cooled reactor in commercial operation from 1972 until the post-fire shutdown after 19 October 1989. The facility is Spain's only uranium natural graphite gas reactor, a UNGG, essentially a duplicate of France's Saint-Laurent-des-Eaux, using natural uranium metal fuel, graphite moderation, and carbon dioxide coolant under pressure in a pre-stressed concrete reactor vessel. Ecologistas en Acción's technical exhibition notes that Vandellòs I was the only Spanish plant belonging to the family, natural uranium, graphite, CO2 as coolant fluid, built to an Électricité de France and Commissariat à l'Énergie Atomique design and producing 55,647 gigawatt-hours in 17 years with a 92.2% availability factor. Owner, Ifrensa, Hispano-Francesa de Energía Nuclear Sociedad Anónima, a joint venture including FECSA, ENGER, Hidroeléctrica de Cataluña, and EDF. Regulator, the Spanish Nuclear Safety Council, Consejo de Seguridad Nuclear, CSN, established in 1980. The core sits inside a pre-stressed concrete reactor vessel. 4 carbon dioxide turbo blowers circulate gas upward through the graphite moderator blocks and natural uranium fuel channels, then through gas-to-water heat exchangers, delivering steam to a secondary circuit and conventional turbo alternators. Spent fuel is shipped to France for reprocessing and plutonium separation, linked to the French military program and documented in contemporary reporting on the temptation of the bomb. Ecologistas en Acción summarise, Vandellòs I was a duplicate of the French Saint-Laurent-des-Eaux plant. Copying Saint-Laurent brought known advantages, but also exported fire protection and segregation weaknesses highlighted by French incidents. Design philosophy treated the turbine island as a conventional industrial hazard, important but outside the primary nuclear safety case. Yet industry history, including a hydrogen-related incident at ASCO in 1984, had already shown that fires in generator areas can have complex consequences. In June 1986, 3 years before the fire, CSN wrote to Hifrensa demanding 5 urgent safety upgrades, including better fire protection and an emergency shutdown cooling modification drawn directly from a Saint-Laurent event. 3 would still be pending on the night of 19 October 1989. 19 June 1986. CSN headquarters, Madrid. A CSN letter requests acciones inmediatas for Vandellòs I, including improved fire protection and adaptations to the emergency cambiador de parada core cooling method, following lessons from Saint-Laurent. On paper, CSN's requirements are binding for continued operation. In practice, press and later court documentation describe Hifrensa's slow implementation and practicas dilatorias on some measures. By October 1989, 3 of the 5 remain unimplemented. Lawyer Mark Viada, who will later act in the criminal case, emphasizes how some required protections were still missing. El Critic quotes Viader, "CSN had insisted on immediate actions and fire protection upgrades, but at the moment of the accident, 3 of the 5 measures were still missing. Technology and logistics present additional gaps. Vandellòs has no dedicated on-site fire brigade. First responders must arrive from the neighbouring Vandellòs 2 plant. There is no resident CSN inspector at Vandellòs. The oversight relies on periodic inspections, and, that night, an inspector from Vandellòs II, Joan Carls. Status of siren systems and public alert infrastructure in 1989 remains incomplete. Communication link performance is unreliable. Direct lines from the control room to CSN work only intermittently. Civil protection operates with limited situational awareness, given partial data flows. Spain in the late 1980s has a modern regulatory body and evolving emergency plans. The Internal Emergency Plan, Plan de Emergencia Interior, PEI, exists for on-site incidents, with defined activation levels. The External Tarragona Nuclear Emergency Plan, PIENTA, exists for public protection measures, but remains incomplete in some aspects of sirens, megaphone systems, and public drills by 1989. CSN's later Lecciones Aprendidas presentation acknowledges gaps in data links, emergency drills, and communication protocols prior to Vandellòs. The regulatory framework exists, but is not yet fully implemented at plant and regional level. When a real event occurs, this partial state of readiness will directly shape how quickly information flows and how decisively external plans are used. By 1989, Spain has never experienced an international nuclear event scale, Level 3 nuclear event. Vandellòs will be the first and the most serious in Western Europe to that date. The plant enters October 1989, classified by CSN as safe to operate, yet without its own fire brigade, without a resident inspector, and with several post-Saint Laurent fire protection requirements still outstanding. 19 October 1989, 2100 hours. Turbine Hall, Vandellòs then. An engineering drawing of the main turbo generator set shows a high-pressure steam turbine, hydrogen-cooled generator, large oil systems, and associated cable runs beneath the turbine floor. Plant documentation treats the turbine island as a conventional industrial hazard, yet industry history has shown that fires in generator areas can have complex consequences. According to historian F.A. Ortega, 35 blades detached from high-pressure turbine number 2, initiating the sequence that would ultimately close the plant. Turbine vibration alarms are routine. Operators expect graceful load reduction and maintenance interventions, not a cascading mechanical failure that ruptures oil and hydrogen systems. High-pressure turbine 2 forms, part of the main turbo-alternator group. The oil lubrication system and hydrogen-cooled generator use hydrogen for efficient cooling, but hydrogen is flammable when mixed with air and oil mist. At 21:39, plant logs record a high vibration alarm on one turbine shaft, followed by low oil pressure alarm and automatic start of emergency oil pumps. Wikipedia, summarizing CSN's preliminary report, notes that a mechanical fracture in turbine 2 caused a vibration alarm, oil pressure loss, and a hydrogen leak that in contact with air and oil at high temperature exploded, causing a fire. The blade failure ruptures the oil and hydrogen circuits. Emergency oil pumps increase flow into a leaking system, feeding the emerging fire in the lower turbo alternator area. Blade impact and vibration damage lead to a hydrogen leak, which ignites in contact with hot oil and air, producing explosions and a rapidly developing fire below the turbine. The Spanish-language accident article states, the failure also caused a hydrogen leak that in contact with air and oil at high temperature exploded, causing a fire. A mechanical fault in the turbine directly compromises oil and hydrogen systems. The resulting fire is conventional, but its position, above cable galleries, adjacent to raw water lines and close to safety-relevant power supplies, creates pathways into the nuclear safety envelope. Ortega's detail notes that this same impact and Vibration will rupture a seawater pipe to the condenser, initiating the flooding that later disables 2 of 4 carbon dioxide blowers. At this moment, the event is still nominally conventional, a turbine accident. Within minutes, flame and smoke will be attacking electrical and cooling systems designated as nuclear safety functions. 19 October 1989, 21:39 to 22:11. Control room and turbine hall, Vandellòs, the 4. Control room logs show the high vibration alarm at 21:39, followed by low oil pressure indications, then the felt shock of explosions from the turbo alternator area. Operators confirm a major fire in the lower turbine hall. Emergency manuals anticipate a structured sequence, classify the event, activate internal emergency plan, and notify CSN. In reality, while internal teams mobilize quickly, external alerts are slower and fragmentary. Control room personnel feel explosions and confirm a major fire in the lower turbine generator 2 area. Civil protection is alerted about 5 minutes after the fire starts. At 22:11, Hifrensa formally informs CSN of the incident. Internal alarms and fire detection systems in the turbine hall activate. Early firefighting attempts use fixed suppression and plant fire teams. Notification at 22:11 to CSN states that an industrial fire has affected systems with nuclear safety relevance. Residents' calls report visible flames as early as 21:15, earlier than the 21:39 control room alarm. CSN later criticizes the initial communication and the absence of early public notification. External media and some retrospective analyses note discrepancies between when flames were visible and when regulators were fully briefed. Plant management and on-duty control room operators handle initial response. CSN duty officers receive the 22:11 call. Fire ignites along oil systems under the turbo alternator, propagating into adjacent cable runs. Early activation of internal emergency teams occurs. Partial evacuation of non-essential areas begins. CSN summarized chronology, quoted in multiple secondary sources, states, the fire began in the main turbo alternator group number 2 as a consequence of a mechanical failure generated by a cracking process. The initial mechanical failure immediately becomes a fire protection test. The lack of fully implemented fire segregation upgrades will soon allow the blaze to move into cable galleries and auxiliary systems. The fire moves from local industrial accident to regulatory concern once CSN is informed that control and cooling systems might be affected, but the delay between first visible flames and formal notification will shape CSN's later critique. At 22:11, CSN knows there is a serious fire near the turbine. They do not yet know that cable galleries are burning and a seawater line has already failed. At 22:11, the event is communicated to CSN as an industrial fire near the turbine. By dawn, CSN's own data will show reactor parameters at 29.7 bar and 310 degrees Celsius. 19 October 1989, approximately 2200 to 2330 hours. Turbine basement, cable galleries, control room. External firefighters arrive from nearby stations and from Vandellòs the First around 2200 hours. They describe a fire that is below their feet, visible mostly as dense smoke emerging from cable trenches rather than open flame. Designers expected electrical redundancy and separation to protect critical systems. In practice, non-fireproof cables allow flames to race along shared paths, and smoke, heat and water damage propagate through the control infrastructure. Firefighters arriving from Vandellòs the Second around 2200 hours describe a difficult scenario. The fire is burning below floor level, visible mainly as smoke. Bombero Xavier Lambrich later recalls, the fire was extremely difficult to attack because it was underground. We had no access to it. We only saw the smoke. Plant designers expected that redundant cabling and power systems would preserve key functions even under fire. In practice, the non-fireproof cables allow fire to spread along trenches, feeding turbo alternator controls, auxiliary power, and parts of the plant computer system. Fire damages 6 kV and low-voltage cables, leading to loss of some instrumentation and control. Direct lines of communication from the control room to CSN work intermittently. plant computers saturate under error signals and several indicators fail. Josep Pino, then fire chief at Amposta, later recounts that technicians left the affected areas and firefighters found themselves without plant guidance. The Spanish-language article quotes Pino, "The technicians fled from the affected areas and we were left alone," while shouts of the reactor is going," were heard. Cable insulation and routing under the turbine floor fail. Loss of sections of 6 kV and low-voltage power occurs. Failures in the central plant computer follow. Intermittent operation of direct telephone links from the control room to CSN hampers communication. El Critic, citing court records, states, "The direct communication telephones with CSN worked intermittently, the computers were saturated, and the operators did not receive information from several indicators because the electrical equipment was failing." Fire in cable galleries degrades instrumentation and control, forcing operators to rely on remaining indicators and local manual checks. CSN in Madrid receives partial, delayed information, limiting their ability to assess core cooling status. Fire in the cable galleries transforms an industrial accident into a nuclear safety challenge by impairing monitoring and some safety-related power supplies. Despite the scale of the internal event, the Plant's Internal Emergency Plan, PEI, is never formally activated, a decision that will later attract regulatory and legal scrutiny. The Internal Plan de Emergencia Interior for the plant remains unactivated throughout this period, a fact that will later draw a 70 million peseta fine from the Spanish government. 19 to 20 October 1989, approximately 22:30 to 0100 hours. Turbine basement, condenser area, reactor building, lower levels. Below the burning turbine floor, attention shifts from smoke to water. As Lambrich later recounts, technicians told firefighters to forget the flames. They said it no longer mattered, that we should dedicate ourselves to getting water out because, in literal words, the core is going on us. Raw water systems are not normally viewed as nuclear critical. Here, the location of seawater lines below the turbine hall and near blower rooms turns them into a direct threat to core cooling once pipe integrity is lost. Ortega describes from the Dialnet paper blade impacts and vibration rupture a seawater pipe to the condenser, leading to large volumes of seawater entering low-lying areas and spreading into the reactor building basement. Heat from the fire melts joints in the seawater lines, allowing large volumes to flood lower levels, including rooms housing carbon dioxide blowers and auxiliary pumps. Condenser seawater circuit layout shows expansion joint or pipe section failure under thermal and mechanical stress. Floodwater plus firefighting water raises levels in the basement, progressively inundating the rooms housing carbon dioxide turbo blowers and auxiliary pumps. 2 of 4 blowers become inoperable due to flooding. Some sources note periods when only one blower is effectively providing forced circulation. Fire crews report that at a certain point, plant staff emphasize the need to get water out to save the core, signaling an internal shift from fire flame risk to flooding cooling risk. Firefighter Xavier Lambrich from La Metla de Mar provides key testimony. CSN Inspector Joan Carls is present at the plant, but not fully informed about core cooling degradation. 2 of the 4 carbon dioxide turbo blowers, responsible for core cooling, become inoperable due to inundation, verified later in judicial findings. Some testimonies cited by journalists assert that at certain moments only one blower remained operable, requiring repeated manual interventions in a dark, partially submerged turbine hall to regulate blower settings. According to the criminal court judgment summarized by El Critic, 2 of the 4 blower machines responsible for cooling the core became inoperative. Ortega notes, "The large inflow of seawater spread to the basement of the reactor building and other areas, combining with firefighting water to produce significant flooding levels. Loss of 2 blowers sharply reduces forced carbon dioxide flow through the hot graphite core. In the period immediately after shutdown, squeezing decay heat removal margins and increasing internal pressure and temperature. Fire-induced damage to seawater lines undermines coolant circulation capacity, turning flooding into the dominant safety threat and pushing reactor parameters toward their limits. While CSN's preliminary report will later document near-limit gas pressure and temperature, neither the on-site CSN inspector nor Madrid has a real-time picture of how many blowers are still operating. Despite this, neither CSN's on-site inspector nor off-site authorities are fully briefed on the blower failures in real time, an information gap that will heavily influence later regulatory criticism. Night of 19 to 20, October 1989, Vandellòs Feng, L'Hospitalet de l'Enfant, nearby towns, CSN Emergency Centre. As firefighters work through the night, Lambrich expects to see mass evacuations when he returns home. Instead, he finds his parents asleep. No public alert has been triggered in the surrounding towns. Inside the plant, firefighters continue working in heavy smoke and high humidity. Outside, towns along the Costa Daurada remain quiet. There are no sirens, no megaphone warnings, and no official shelter-in-place instructions. Emergency plans anticipate progressive activation of on-site and off-site measures. Instead, the PEI remains undeclared, and Penta is activated at only a minimal level. Some residents hear about the situation directly from firefighters, not from authorities. Spanish emergency plans anticipate activation of Vandellòs' internal PEI and, if needed, the external Tarragona nuclear emergency plan, Penta. In practice, Plant Director Carlos Fernández Palomero never declares an internal emergency, and Penta is only activated at level 0 by civil authorities. Carlos Fernández Palomero serves as Plant Director. Isabel Melado, former CSN Technical Safety Director, later recounts the lack of detailed information from the plant. Government Civil, later Delegación del Gobierno, in Tarragona implements only level 0 measures. No public sirens are activated, no shelter-in-place or evacuation orders are issued, though some residents self-evacuate after being alerted by firefighters. CSN's emergency centre operates with fragmentary information, and some direct telephone lines from the plant work only intermittently. Status of siren systems and public alert infrastructure in 1989 proves inadequate. Communication link performance falters. Direct lines from the control room to CSN work only intermittently. Civil Protection's limited situational awareness results from partial data flows. El País reports that many local residents learned of the incident only the next day, and that CSN later criticized that information to the public had been delayed and incomplete. Melado later states that with complete information, Penta should have been escalated to level 1, which would have imposed access controls to the affected territory. Undercommunication constrains possible protective measures and undermines public confidence later, even though the final radiological impact is 0. Underestimation and incomplete reporting constrain the regulatory response and delay potential protective actions, even as technical margins inside the plant continue to erode. Years later, the Spanish government will impose a 70 million peseta fine on Hifrensa for obstructing correct emergency plan management, a sanction ultimately annulled on constitutional grounds, but preserved as an official acknowledgement of the communication failures. Within a month, about 40,000 people will march in Barcelona demanding permanent closure of Vandellòs I, making an internal plant incident a national issue. The political consequence? Within a month, approximately 40,000 people will march in Barcelona demanding permanent closure of Vandellòs I, making an internal plant incident a national issue. 19 to 20 October 1989, late night. Reactor core and containment, Vandellòs Pereira. Reconstructed key parameters from CSN reports, as summarized by El Critic, show gas pressure in the core at 29.7 bar, limit for leakage at 30.1 bar. Coolant inlet temperature at 310 degrees Celsius, limit for avoiding gas emission at 315 degrees Celsius. The public narrative emphasizes no radiological consequences. The underlying data reveal that thermal, hydraulic and pressure margins were only a few bar and a few degrees from thresholds tied to potential releases. CSN data summarized in later reporting show gas circuit pressure in the core reaching 29.7 bar, with the design threshold for leakage at 30.1 bar. Coolant inlet temperature hits 310 degrees Celsius, 5 degrees shy of the 315 degrees Celsius limit for preventing gas releases. The plant's safety case assumed that multiple redundant cooling paths and blowers would keep post-trip decay heat removal comfortably within margins. Partial loss of blowers, flooding, and degraded monitoring compressed these margins to a few bar and a few degrees. Natural uranium, graphite-moderated core generates substantial residual heat after shutdown. Carbon dioxide coolant operates with a design envelope that includes maximum allowable pressure and temperature to prevent leakage through seals and relief paths. Containment pool temperatures and internal vessel pressure climb toward design limits, though they ultimately remain below them. Explanation of decay heat in a natural uranium graphite core shortly after shutdown. The fission process leaves isotopes that continue releasing thermal energy. Function of carbon dioxide blowers and gas-to-water heat exchangers in removing that residual power becomes critical. Relationship between gas pressure, temperature, and potential for leakage through seals or relief paths determines safety margins. Elcritic notes that, according to CSN, at 29.7 bar and 310 degrees Celsius, the incident was close to contaminating its entire surroundings. CSN-derived data cited by Elcritic: 29.7 bars of gas pressure. Above 30.1 bars, radioactivity leaks to the exterior would have begun. Wikipedia's note states that core temperature came within about 3 degrees of a radiological spill, and that pool temperature and internal vessel pressure approached maximum admissible values. European Union and CSN summaries later state that the event caused significant plant damage but had no radiological consequences for the population or environment. Loss of 2 blowers and compromised cooling drives, pressure and temperature upward. Manual efforts to keep at least partial circulation and to restore cooling stop the trend before design limits are exceeded. Despite impaired systems, local action, keeping at least part of the blower capacity running and progressively restoring cooling, prevents crossing thresholds that would trigger actual radioactive releases. Officially, Vandellòs the Föhn is the most serious nuclear accident in Western Europe, with no recorded radiological impact on the public. Yet, numerically, it operates for hours just below envelope limits for pressure and temperature. Technically, Vandellòs I remains an international nuclear event scale Level 3 incident with no measurable public exposure. Politically and procedurally, it becomes an archetype of how a conventional fire can push a graphite gas reactor to the edge of its licensed envelope. 19 to 20, October 1989, approximately 2300 to 0600 hours. Vandellòs the Föhn interior. Dawn approaches as firefighters and plant technicians continue working in confined, humid spaces. The official timeline notes that the fire was fully extinguished past 4 in the morning, with manual re-establishment of the cooling circuit and final reactor shutdown. The safety case relies on automated systems and clear emergency procedures. Reality devolves into ad hoc manual interventions under poor visibility, with partial instrumentation and evolving priorities from flame to water to cooling. Fire in the turbine hall is progressively controlled. At some point around 0100 hours, the focus fully shifts to pumping out water and stabilizing the cooling chain. According to Elcritic, the fire is under control around 0100 hours, but work to reduce flooding lasts all night. Emergency procedures envisioned well-instrumented shutdown and cooling. Instead, technicians repeatedly enter dark, flooded areas without reliable power to adjust blowers and valves by hand. Local firefighters from Catalonia's core work alongside plant technicians. Plant technicians, later interviewed in CSN's Lecciones Aprendidas sessions, describe multiple entries to adjust blowers and valves. Progressive restoration of at least 2 blowers and of seawater flow paths occurs. Alignment of alternate cooling modes, such as the cambiador de parada, emergency shutdown heat exchanger, proceeds, even though its CSN-mandated upgrade had not yet been implemented. Use and limitations of the cambiador de parada emergency shutdown heat exchanger chain, which CSN had earlier asked to be modified, become evident. Progressive reduction in core temperature and internal pressure follows as decay heat falls. Monitoring shifts to whatever instruments remain functional. Operators correlate fragmentary readings with physical inspections. Plant technicians, some later interviewed anonymously, describe multiple entries into the turbine building to adjust equipment. One worker interviewed by CSN technician Julio Perez later recalls, "We never said the very serious situation we were in for fear of losing our jobs." Wikipedia summary states, "The fire was extinguished and the cooling circuit was manually reactivated, shutting down the plant. Quiet, manual interventions, rather than automated systems, keep coolant flowing long enough for decay heat to drop and for pressure and temperatures to recede from their limits. Manual control of cooling, rather than fully designed, fully functional automation, keeps the reactor below its design thresholds, preventing fuel damage and large releases. When dawn breaks and the core is stably cooled, the human cost is exhaustion rather than injury." Firefighters recall collapsing outside the plant, convinced hours earlier that they might not survive the night. When the fire is out and cooling stable, Vandellòs is saved technically, but the plant's future as an operating reactor is effectively over. 23 November 1989 and early 1990s. CSN, Madrid. The cover page of CSN's preliminary report, Accidente del 19 de octubre de 1989 en 100 Vandellòs Premen, Informe Preliminar, is dated 23 November 1989. Public summaries stress that there were no off-site radiological consequences. Internally, the report classifies the event as International Nuclear Event Scale Level 3 and documents significant impairment of safety functions. On 23 November 1989, CSN approves its preliminary Accidente del 19 de octubre de 1989 en 100 Vandellòs Fenton report, classifying the incident as Level 3 on the International Nuclear Event Scale, Incidente Importante, important incident. Officially, the accident is framed as serious but not catastrophic, with no radiological consequences. However, CSN's technical documents and later external analyses emphasize how close parameters came to their limits and how fire, flooding and communication failures eroded multiple layers of defense in depth. Non-fireproof cabling and insufficient compartmentalization of electrical systems prove inadequate. Vulnerable routing of seawater lines and lack of protection against turbine hall fires create cascading failures. Degraded reliability of communication links and emergency procedures hampers response. Fire protection deficiencies include non-fireproof cables and insufficient compartmentalization. Vulnerability of raw water systems routing under the turbine hall becomes evident. Insufficient redundancy and physical separation for power and control of critical cooling equipment is documented. The unmodified cambiador de parada and incomplete implementation of CSN's 1986 safety requests are noted. International Nuclear Event Scale Classification, Incidente Importante, Level 3, due to collapse of the cooling system and impairment of major safety functions. Ecologistas en Acción summarize CSN's finding that the fire causes important dysfunctions in several systems necessary to guarantee reactor cooling. CSN's findings form the technical foundation for later political decisions on whether Vandellòs can be economically or acceptably modernized for further operation. By codifying these weaknesses, CSN's report both justifies a strict regulatory stance for restart and establishes Vandellòs as a reference case for fire-initiated nuclear incidents. Official European Union documentation later repeats that Vandellòs accident caused important damage, but had no radiological consequences, capturing the paradox that will dominate the legal and political debates: severe plant damage, zero documented exposure, and intense argument over responsibility. While CSN reports confirm near-limit conditions inside the plant, official statements to the public consistently use the phrase, "no radiological consequences," setting up the social and legal debate of the next chapter. 1990 to 2000. Provincial Court of Tarragona, Spain. 10 years after the fire, a trial is held in the Audiencia Provincial de Tarragona, between 19 and 25 January 2000. 5 senior Hifrensa managers are charged with risk of omission offences related to the incident. Activists and some local institutions expect convictions for documented safety deficiencies and communication failures. The ultimate verdict acquits the accused. citing an unknown and undetectable design error as the root cause of the fire. More than 10 years after the fire, the case finally reaches the Audiencia Provincial de Tarragona between 19 and 25 January 2000. Given documented safety deficiencies and the near-miss character of the event, some citizens and activists expect convictions, or at least strong judicial condemnation. Instead, court findings confirm many facts, but acquit the accused. Marc Vader serves as lawyer for the popular prosecution. Hifrenza senior managers are ultimately acquitted. Judges of the Audiencia Provincial de Tarragona issue the verdict. Later, Constitutional Court judges annul the 70 million peseta fine. The judgment accepts that safety requirements had not been fully met and that 2 of 4 blowers failed. It also accepts that emergency plans were not fully activated, yet it concludes that even full compliance with the outstanding safety measures would not definitely have prevented the initiating turbine failure, and therefore holds that irregularities were not legally determinant for the accident. Wikipedia and press note, the court recognizes that required improvements were not fully implemented and that emergency plans were not correctly applied, yet decides these factors were not legally determinant. El Critic notes, the judicial sentence certifies all these facts, but those responsible were acquitted. The legal framing, design error rather than operational negligence, limits personal accountability but does not alter the political reality that Vandellòs will remain shut down and be decommissioned. The exculpatory verdict combined with annulment of the emergency plan fine shapes public perception. Vandellòs becomes a symbol of institutional near-miss with zero legal accountability despite verified technical shortcomings. Vandellòs is still characterized decades later as the most serious nuclear accident that occurred in Spain and in all of Western Europe, but with 0 fatalities, 0 injuries, and 0 convicted individuals. Protest records show that 6 weeks after the accident, approximately 35,000 people gathered in Barcelona's Plaça de Sant Jaume to demand closure of Vandellòs 4. The legal system closes the case. Public and regulatory pressure proceed along another track. 1990 to 2028. Planned. Vandellòs site, Enresa, CSN. CSN's Information General notes that after the 19 October 1989 fire, commercial operation ended. Ownership transferred to Enresa, Empresa Nacional de Residuos Radioactivos, Sociedad Anónima, by ministerial order on 28 January 1998 to implement the Plan de Desmantelamiento y Clausura de Vandellòs Fires. Initially, some expected Vandellòs to be repaired and restarted. Instead, the combination of high retrofit costs, obsolescence of the UNGG design, and political pressure leads to permanent shutdown and staged dismantling. Enresa's decommissioning report describes auxiliary buildings gone, a large blue box enclosing the reactor systems, designed to blend into the landscape while containing activated structures during a multi-decade latency period. The reactor never suffers a meltdown, and there is no measured public exposure, yet Spain commits to a long, complex dismantling project costing an estimated 40 billion pesetas, approximately 240 million euros. Level 2 decommissioning occurs between 1998 and 2003, removal of all systems and buildings external to the reactor box, creation of a large concrete cajon enclosing the empty core. Latency phase lasts approximately 25 to 30 years to allow decay of activation products in 2,700 tons of graphite and structural materials prior to final dismantling. Estimated decommissioning cost reaches approximately 40 billion pesetas, approximately 240 million euros. The 25-year accident anniversary exhibition notes that the reactor box is maintained for a period of 25 years, during which radioactivity naturally decays. In 2028, the dismantling of the reactor box will proceed. A fire with no radiological impact nonetheless commits Spain to decades of decommissioning work and hundreds of millions of euros in costs, illustrating how nuclear safety failures can generate long-term financial and logistical burdens even without measurable exposure. ENRISA's characterization of Vandellòs the Hahn as one of the world's early large-scale decommissioning projects for a gas graphite reactor turns a 1989 incident into a reference case for decommissioning practice. By the late 2010s, CSN and ENRISA present Vandellòs the Furs as a reference project for complex gas graphite reactor decommissioning, even as activists continue to spotlight it as the most serious nuclear incident that occurred in Spain. 1989 to present. Spain, CSN, ENRISA, and the international nuclear safety community. At a 2019 CSN event marking 30 years of the Vandellòs accident, regulators and experts revisit the sequence as a case study in lessons learned, alongside later events like Fukushima Daiichi. Early nuclear safety paradigms focused heavily on core physics, reactivity excursions, and loss of coolant accident scenarios. Vandellòs underscores that conventional industrial hazards, turbine mechanical failures, hydrogen fires, cable routing, raw water flooding, can become primary nuclear threats by disabling safety functions. CSN, or Media Retrospective, marking the anniversary of Vandellòs, shows regulators presenting slides on lecciones aprendidas, while photographs of the 1989 fire and the current blue box appear side by side. Early safety thinking focused on reactivity excursions and loss of coolant accidents inside the nuclear island. Vandellòs demonstrates that turbine hall mechanics, electrical cabling, and raw water systems can be initiating events for serious nuclear incidents. Strengthened fire protection standards and cable segregation in Spanish plants follow. Real-time data links from all reactors to CSN are installed. Extensive emergency brigade training proceeds. By 2009, about 85% of Tarragona's emergency service staff have trained in nuclear plants. Upgraded public alert systems with sirens, megaphone networks, and clearer criteria for activating external plans are implemented. CSN and subsequent analyses repeat the judgment. The Vandellòs accident caused important damage to the installations, but had no radiological consequences for the population. Vandellòs the Fern becomes a case study in the integrated treatment of conventional and nuclear hazards, influencing not only Spanish practice but also international guidance on fire and flooding risks in multi-unit sites. The accident reorients Spanish nuclear safety culture toward integrated treatment of conventional and nuclear hazards, and it contributes to international awareness of fire and flooding risks in multi-unit sites and non-light water designs. El Critic summarizes the long-term paradox. Vandellòs leaves 0 deaths and 0 injuries, but also 0 responsible parties, and a bill that is still being paid. Today, European Union and CSN documents still describe the accident as one that caused important damage to the installations, but had no radiological consequences. Yet CSN's own pressure and temperature figures show how close Vandellòs came to crossing that line. Vandellòs remains the most serious nuclear accident in Western Europe, classified at International Nuclear Event Scale Level 3, not because it released radioactivity, but because a turbine generator fire and a broken seawater line brought a gas graphite reactor within a few bar and a few degrees of its design limits, and forced a country to rethink how ordinary industrial failures can threaten nuclear safety.